Thank you. I'm honored to be invited to speak at this very excellent conference where you can talk about standards. That's not very often that you get a chance to do that in front of an audience. Now, standards is of course a topic that often sends people to sleep, which after lunch is always a danger. I can see the picture, but sadly you cannot. So now it's arriving. The topic of this talk was actually inspired very much by previous speaker's presentation, Julia, who asked the question, why can't we all just get along with standards and technical solutions? And that was really a question that I took up, and I thought we need to explore a little bit further. So what you're going to hear in the next half hour is some thoughts on life after Proforma, what should come next. I will use the National Library of Estonia's experience with born digital content as an example, but I'll try to make some suggestions what should come next, and hopefully also open the floor up to Natasha's paper that follows immediately after me. And I think I will also, if you come back tomorrow and listen to what Milena has to say in one of the final papers of this conference, the three of them will form a nice little continuum. This half year, Estonia runs the presidency of the EU. That means that we have conferences all over Tallinn and Estonia almost every day. You could, not go to work for 6 months and just attend meetings. It's quite interesting. I've been to quite a number of them. Culture, education. Just this last week, there was a big do about e-government and also digital information. There's lots of topics that keep coming up. And the main keywords that I picked up from those events is efficiency, access, and trust. There are a few more that you can hear here and there. There's like participation or participatory cultures. Blockchain is often mentioned. Personal data, privacy, GDPR, all those things keep coming up. But if you think of these three keywords, then preservation, digital preservation, really is at the core of these things. These are the same topics that we've been discussing for a really, really long time already as a community. But somehow preservation was never mentioned at any of these presidency events that I've been to. So although we talk about the same topics, we do not feature in those discussions as an important topic. And that means that we're somehow not getting along with some of the discussions that are happening around us. Could it be that our standards that we have for ourselves are not as widely adopted as we would like to think? In a way, digital preservation is like cooking. This follows the lunch. I was thinking about it as I was munching away at lunchtime. There are many cooking traditions. Take Italian kitchen, for example. Many of the ingredients that are used there, what we call traditional Italian cooking, I mean, this has been tradition only for 100 or so years, because some of the ingredients come from across the ocean or from very far away continents, but they've been adopted into Italian kitchen and have now become a tradition. Digital preservation does the same with standards. We very freely adopt standards from all kinds of other communities that have developed them and make them our own. We have some of our own standards, and Proforma has been very good at capitalizing on them or building on these standards, but perhaps there's more that we can do. So if we look at the digital preservation as a generic system that has 4 components, so you have the objects that we're working on. These are your ingredients when you're cooking. You have processes for what you do when you're cooking. you know how to boil an egg or peel a potato. There are rules how to behave with one or another file format, for example. We have lots of technologies and systems that we employ for doing that. Lots of utensils in your kitchen. You have your ovens and your sieves and your knives and peelers and whatnot. And you have people. That together forms a complete system that interact with each other to produce a result. This is very generic systems theory, nothing really behind it. If we look at the standards in digital preservation that we have for these components, then we have lots of standards for file formats. They're the technical object level standards, and we're quite good at employing them. Perform an excellent example of how to do that. We have the OIS that tells us how to behave in the kitchen. What are the processes that you have to go through to achieve something presentable at the other end to put on the table of diners in your kitchen. And there are a few other guidelines and you could say standards for service levels or service level definitions that would fall into that category. We're not so good at standards for technologies and tools. We have good tool registries, but we're as yet not so good at standardizing that level, and I will come back to that. But even in the presentations just before lunch, the people who have worked on the 3 excellent tools that Performa project delivers, they had 3 different scenarios for what happens after the sponsorship of Performa project ends. There are many different ways how we handle and manage our tools. So this area is perhaps less covered with standards and kind of standardized approaches. Probably the area where we are least developed with standards is people and competencies that are required for doing digital preservation. There are many international initiatives that look at curricula and even attempts of defining a kind of professional competency standard for digital preservation, but none of them have really taken off as widely as, let's say, OIS or PDFA. So there is clearly work to be done in that area. On the other hand, what we have is an overview standard or standards that you might call kitchen management, those that help you to make sense how all of these things fit together to produce a result. So we have the Trusted Digital Repository checklists, we have the ISO standard for conformance checking. So effectively it's trying to be like a quality setting standard for digital preservation. So all of this sort of fits nicely together. We all work within this framework. I think we have our discipline or community-based different flavors. Libraries do digital preservation a little bit in their own way, archives differently, museums, if they do it, then again in a specific way. It could be based on type of content that you're curating. If you're more into art or more into audiovisual content, then you're doing it one way. If you're mostly database-based, then you're doing slightly differently. So there is an Italian cooking and Chinese cooking and Mexican cooking in digital preservation, but they all come to the same end result. We use the same tools, ingredients are different, the outcome is the same. It should be a dip for everyone to enjoy. So let's look at the joy of cooking and digital preservation at the National Library of Estonia, and what is the maturity level where we're at this institution. This beautiful picture of taming a beast I nicked from a book that I recently came across. It's a historic book. I don't know why it has that cover picture, but I thought it's rather appropriate. So, National Library of Estonia has, for the last 9 months, or 9.5 almost now, enjoyed something that is called digital legal deposit. Last year, we had our legal deposit legislation amended, which made it compulsory for publishers to deposit digital versions of their printed works, outputs, and I can't say only publications, it covers a much wider range. So anything that is serialized or printed in Estonia or about Estonia should also be deposited in a digital version to the National Library. Kristel mentioned also this in her introductory talk. This is all wonderful. We have declared digitization as a final or a finite project at the National Library here. Starting from 1st of January this year, we don't really need to digitize anything new that arrives at the library any longer. It's a new era for libraries in Estonia. But that's all interesting for library people. If we look at it from a preservation point of view, what changes can we see? Of course, it's not on a global scale of things, but within our own local group or local scene, this is a fairly radical step up in both complexity and volume. We have been collecting born digital legal deposit previously already on kind of bilateral agreements with publishers, especially newspapers, have for more than 10 years already been deposited with the National Library, but now we get books and all kinds of other interesting publications, some of them maybe not so interesting, but they come here anyway, all those leaflets that you get in your mailbox and that kind of stuff. So lots of digital stuff arriving here. It has become more complex. There is more issues with them, and this is where Proforma tools will help us out greatly in the very near future already. There is also, let's say, an upgrade or a jump up in the expectations of users and also publishers in how quickly we can process all this. So the moment they drop their files in our deposit system, they expect that in seconds the file will already be visible as submitted to the archives. Most of this was what we expected, and this is how we prepared for this. So, like any good kitchen, if you're starting a new recipe or rethinking how to manage your kitchen, do you have the right staff? Do you have all the good recipes in hand? We've updated the list of file formats that we're accepting. We tied them with service levels and said if you're submitting that kind of file, then we can only offer this sort of preservation with it. If we discover those kinds of errors with your PDF file, then we may not be able to deliver to the end users in exactly that shape or form, because over time something will happen to it and all of those things. Obviously we have to automate a lot more, because libraries traditionally are fairly manual organizations. When it comes to more interesting responses, it turned out that we really have to reconceptualize what the digital preservation focus, the function of the library here is. What kind of content falls under that remit, and how do we conceptualize a preservation system around it? And that's where it comes to a decision that we really need a new kind of kitchen to keep running this function at the library. And that's probably a stage where quite a number of memory institutions in Europe are arriving at. within the next year or two, they're realizing that their current digital repository system is no longer up for the job, or not up to scratch for dealing with all the different types of content that they are receiving. Sometimes it's due to the born digital content, like in our case. Sometimes it could be other things. So our remit, when we sum it up, is not just digitized and born digital content. It includes web archive. Digital inserts is something kind of legacy material, diskettes and CDs that were put inside books as extra material, but now become or are running a risk of becoming unreadable, so we have to copy them off, but they often include software or multimedia content and other interesting media types or data types that make our life more colorful. But software is the key issue here. Publishers are publishing their content as packages within software already. Everything that happens in the computer that disguises itself as a mobile phone in your pocket happens within a software environment. So although we collect newspapers as PDF files, and we collect them as paper publications, and we collect them as online news portals through our web archive, there is another channel or another medium, the apps in your mobile phone, where newspapers are updating the content all the time. And there's lots more than in other digital environments in those software packages. Often there is, of course, targeted advertising or paid for services or freemium services or competitions and quizzes and those kinds of things that may not be interesting, but videos, sound clips, interviews and things like that, they are actually quite interesting. For the time being, our library is not collecting those publications or those types of publications because we are unable to. Not just to collect them, but also to preserve them. And it's an appraisal decision, should we be doing it if we are already collecting the same material in 3 other formats, or should we definitely be doing it, although it's technically very complex. This is a judgment question for collection building, but it's also a question of what kind of repository do we need in the end. So if I try to kind of read the symptoms here and see how, try to summarize what our response has been and perhaps compare it a little bit with what our other memory institutions are doing, then we can see that where our main focus is still definitely on ingest at this stage. And we just started with a new workflow, as it were, for taking in those born digital publications. And most of our effort and steam right now goes on making sure that whatever we're getting from the publishers is up to standard, up to scratch, so that we can preserve it. And Vera PDF is definitely part of the plan here, to not just kind of defend the position of the library here, but also to make publishers more aware of issues that the files that they are producing on a daily basis, what they may have or not. So we can certainly use it as part of our own, outreach or awareness-raising campaign as well, to teach publishers how to produce better content so that it is easier to preserve. When it comes to tools and services and software products that are out there for helping us, this is definitely quite overwhelming. There's 2 types of problem. One is that there's too many of them. We have tool registries. Copter, I think, is right now the best of them. In a project a while back, Milena and I did a report on digital preservation tools, and we listed just over 200, or was it 250 of them, and tried to identify whether they are still alive, are they being supported, can they still be used, is there documentation available? And we could determine that kind of alive status to only a fraction of them. So we have lots of tools. How do you choose the best one from them? And even once you've chosen one, it often ends up looking like this, that you feel you need a lot of competence to work with, even though it's performing a very simple task for you. I actually pinched this picture from Twitter feed this morning. I liked it so much, it came from a digital archaeology project. But I think, well, quite a lot of us in this room have been there and witnessed that. Some of you are so young that you don't remember that silly thing in the corner of your Microsoft Office software anymore. But sometimes the digital preservation software that we are using, you actually crave for that little helper to be there. Somehow when I had this, often was a dog that was jumping up and down there in the corner. It's a default setting somehow. And I quickly got rid of it, but these days when it comes to preservation software, I think some of us would like to have a little helper there in the corner. So we need to produce simpler software. There are so many institutions out there that don't have dedicated staff for this sort of thing, don't have lots of IT expertise in this area. The maturity of this field has reached that level where most people are looking for a service. I want a service that runs. Describe what your service is offering. When you go to someone and say, here's an interesting, here's a bunch of ingredients and here's a bunch of pots and pans and knives and, get cooking. They'd say, no, I'd rather go to a restaurant and be served there with what you're after. So although tools are very important, and also understanding what is happening inside them, as we saw in Julia's paper, we also have to make an effort to make them simpler to use. And as a last point here, I think we're certainly struggling with thinking of not just what kind of new repository platform we need, but also how are we going to get all our content from our existing pots and jars and repositories and file systems into that new environment? How can we define those rules so that it's not just straightforward file transfer or copy command, but so that we could also introduce some quality checking into our files in that migration process? That's a crucial moment. You undertake that kind of migration maybe once every 10, 12, 15 years. It's a very good moment for stock taking and understanding what is still there in your repository, where might be the preservation issues with your files. So what we're looking for are standards for those kinds of interoperability rules. And this is not really there yet. And I'm sure Natasha is going to give a few good answers to my problem and my questions here. But I think what we are now almost ready for in the digital preservation communities is to start looking a little bit above the individual file formats and file level issues. It's been understood from the very beginning of digital preservation that the real issue here is that information needs to live longer than systems that created it or where it currently resides. So at the end of the day, preservation is a question of interoperability between software systems. Yes, files can go missing or get corrupted or or something can go wrong with files in there. But I think we're, thanks to Performa and other projects like this, we're now at the level where we can, be pretty confident about that what happens on the file level is safe. So what we should next focus on is the interoperability conditions or standards, if I prefer to use the word standards, and that would help us to define how do we get our content from one system to another with the functionalities attached so that it can live for longer. This is a call for action. I think we should start from the systems that are closest to us, these very repository systems that we're running ourselves. And they are, they also become obsolete over time, just as we have realized at the National Library here. Just over lunch, I was talking to a colleague from another Nordic country who are facing exactly the same problem. We need to think of what platform comes next. So here's a good chance. Let's take this community. Let's think of the interoperability standards between repository systems and kick off this work. There are already a few good examples. eArc, a parallel project to Performa that finished earlier this year or about a year ago, produced a very nice framework of standards that they want to keep maintaining after the end of the project. But again, though discuss mostly ingest of material into archives, but nevertheless has done some really excellent work on interoperability. And Persist project that Natasha is going to tell you about just in a few minutes. So there are already good examples that are taking this path. So I think we need to build around them. And as my final suggestion, I thought that we should start thinking of digital preservation not so much as longevity or sustainability or even a trust issue, but think of it in terms of resilience. Especially if we move the discussion up to the level of software systems and how do we make them interoperable, then resilience is a more useful concept, I would suggest, than sustainability. Rather than trying to preserve something unchanged through time, we try to make it adaptable or surviving in changing conditions, so that the core properties or the significant properties still remain the same. But I think that will leave for another discussion. I have 1 minute left. So here are the conclusions. Many institutions have been saying for a long time that there is a big tsunami of born digital content about to hit memory institutions. And the National Library here certainly is experiencing that. It's not really a tsunami in our case, but still a significant flooding. And there's many ways how you can fight that kind of situation. You can start stacking up sandbags and say we try to keep the water out. You can go improving your plumbing and working on your automation of workflows issues, or you can start thinking slightly differently about how you do digital preservation. So if we again move the focus now from file formats to systems, maybe we can be better at surfing those big waves that are hitting us. And standards are certainly a good way of going about that business. So, and I would still like to bring the competencies and skills also up, because that's an area where digital preservation is missing a lot. I doubt that a project like Performa could come up with competency standards, but if we collectively start using these tools, then skills and competencies will come as well. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Raivo. I think that you touched a point which is very important, and that is we need to preserve in a resilient way, and we need to preserve not only the files but also the context. Mm-hmm. And if we want to use standards, we have to develop new standards to take into account the complexity of the context where the files are embedded mm-hmm. more and more. And probably this is a new frontier for the new research on mm-hmm. preservation. Thank you very much. Okay. Indeed. As I mentioned before, for any questions, the speakers are around. You know that the format of this conference is open, so please feel free to address directly the speaker with the questions to create groups that discuss the various matters. And I'm proud now to introduce the next speaker, who is Natasha Milik-Freiling. She is a professor and chair of data science at the School of Computer Science of the University of Nottingham. She has a long track record in computer science, research and innovation in digital content management and analysis, online communication and social interactions. Her current focus is on digital obsolescence and privacy, respecting technology designs. Following her involvement in EU-funded projects such as Planet and Escape, she is serving as a chair of the Technology and Research Work Group for the UNESCO Persist. And Natasha is going to talk to us about safeguarding digital heritage through sustained use of legacy software. Or maybe resilient use of legacy software. Okay, great. Okay, very good. Do you have a clicker? Or just quick?
No. Is there a remote?
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. While this is technical stuff is getting sorted, I would like to reveal my agenda. So the main purpose of this presentation to me is to raise the awareness of the importance of software. Raivo talked about the systems, also talked about the pain that we have with systems that are not interoperable, the systems that become obsolete very quickly. So the core question here is to understand a little bit what is the nature of obsolescence, why it happens, and what is the bigger ecosystem? Because without understanding the bigger ecosystem, it's really hard to fix things. And one thing that I just want to mention, because Raivo made a whole list of things I'm going to talk about, just to comment on the standards. So part of the UNESCO discussion that started in 2013, when we had the first meeting with ICT industry, representatives of archives and libraries, and also from digital arts and other areas. And the first thing was a message from entrepreneurs and businesses. They said, give us the standards and then we'll build the solutions that fit the standards. Because that's the only way one can achieve enough of a consistency in the marketplace. So it's very clear what is the demand, and then there is a supply. And the reason why obsolescence happens is exactly when the demand goes down. So if demand for something goes down, or artificially sometimes goes down, before joining Nottingham, I worked for Microsoft Research for 17 years. For 17 years, I was doing research in creating new technologies that would create innovation and make people's lives better. Yeah? So always thinking ahead, how are we going to do better? And another thing was, when talking to product teams, every time we would want to transfer another technology to them, because we said this is going to be better search, better browsing, better filtering. Every time they would basically say to us, look, I've got a list of 200 items here. These are all the features coming from the market. These are all the features that people want. And you're coming to me yet another one. And so we researchers, of course, without understanding even the economics of it, we would just plead and say, look, but this is so much better, right? But the point here is that whenever innovation happens, it happens because there is a demand in the market. And no company will implement a feature unless there is demand, believe me, especially mature companies. They don't innovate necessarily because it's much easier and they have to maintain what they already have. So when the demand is there, the software stays. When the demand is not there, software is slowly phased away and the new stuff comes in. The biggest danger is when the company is not around anymore. So when the software is gone. And so then we content owners and curators and we are then stuck with the software we can't have access. And then what happens is open source comes to rescue because whatever is opened, it can be accessible as a software code, then we can fix it, so we can continue maintaining it. So that's why open source is such a good way of eliminating dependency on the source code that is not available. However, even within the open source community, there is very little understanding of the standards in the design of systems, and also there is very little promise or structure that something will be continued. So I hear a lot about if open source is safe, the community will have it. But I'll show you later, colleague Roberto Di Cosmo is now collecting the open source code. He's got billions of files. I want to know how these billions of files now map onto human beings who are going to fix them. Yeah, so in a way, I just want to bring this up because this is kind of a bigger context. Now I'll go to the presentation and then try to illustrate this further in some of the examples. Okay. So first I would like to talk about one aspect that from computer science point of view you may interest you, because I'll give you a perspective as a computer scientist. I'm not really, I'm a mathematician, by the way. I just work with computer scientists for all these years and they're tolerating me. But I want to say there is something sort of problematic with calling preservation and using digital aspects to preserve something. And the reason is being information in the past has been encoded in something that materially is persistent. And I'm bringing this picture to bring us to the first innovation in computer science that made computing popular or accessible to everybody. When Turing and the company, when they started using computing, it was not done for us to see things. It was done to crunch numbers. They basically needed to create something that can do what human being cannot. They need something that can crunch numbers faster, that can execute commands that humans cannot. So that was the main purpose, and the first applications were actually for engineers. It was not for us to read on the screen. And some of us, like myself, I remember writing first Fortran programs, and as a mathematician, I had to write some numerical analysis to solve differential equations and take them to a computer and then with the punch cards and then wait for the results. So I never seen anything on the screen. There was nothing I could see. So it was really the introduction of the WYSIWYG interfaces. This was done at Xerox, when in fact on the screen we could see things. And then suddenly, crunching numbers and just doing program to calculate static for the bridge or something like that, it wasn't that attractive. It was very attractive to actually enable people to see on the screen what they are computing. So the first killer application that Microsoft had bought for whoever, I'm not sure whether they developed it, but it was actually a spreadsheet. So that basically revolutionized the use of PCs. So the WYSIWYG interface, when people can see what's on the screen, that was the first time that the masses could then engage. And then, of course, engage on visually seeing or hearing things. Okay. But then that caused also another sort of mental state where when we see something on the screen, we think it's material. We think actually it's something that we can touch, or that we can. It's not, it's just an experience. While the program is running, then we can see it. Yeah. And we can see it in the form that the designer of the screen layout actually showed us. So this sort of thing, realizing that this information is the most ephemeral of all, and it's it is the least persistent of all, because it lasts only while the program is running and lasts only if you have electricity. Yeah, so if you basically say that we're going to preserve information in digital, we are not preserving it. We are just showing it. Yeah, so that notion of preservation is really sort of in contradiction with the very medium. Okay, so just another. I just want to show you one other thing is the first machines, and I live in England, so this kind of comes very natural to me. Bletchley Park has the machines, first machines that were used, so you can go and inspect them and see them. They were colossal. They were really fantastic. And we have managed within the last, so this was 1951, in less than 70 years, to squash that into such a small devices. But what's most important is to see how complex the ecosystem became. So this is the ecosystem now. The ecosystem of technologies on one side, where we have all sorts of things. We have a very elaborate ecosystem where there's huge dependencies among different layers. So we have operating systems, we have communication protocols, we then have content readers, and we normally, as users, we experience only part of these applications. Many others are hidden in a stack, very complex stack. On the right-hand side, we use the tools to create all these digital assets, the databases, presentations, games, simulations, computations. So all of that is realized through these technologies. But then, in the middle is the experience. When we put them together, we can actually see it. We can interact with it. Yeah. So what we are doing when we're trying to think about digital, most of the time we are focused on this, because everybody says, did you save your files? Did you back it up? Good, you backed it up. So in a way, we are all the time thinking about how to curate, how to create more metadata, how we can find things, and those are files. This thing nobody asks us about. And I claim, based on design of the systems, that they don't really want us to touch this. When you get your PC, the installations that are there are done by somebody else, it's IT personnel. These are the experts who know how to make these things work. But you and I probably are not thinking about how we're going to now preserve both, get the software plus the data so that we can make it run together. They are completely separated. And then on top of this, we have the WYSIWYG interface that all they do is give us a couple of buttons and we press the buttons. Even very complicated applications, even Excel, for example, this is all programmed in advance. You can put if-then statement or something like this, but that's basically it. Everything is through the WYSIWYG interface, everything is on buttons. So our experience are really confined to whatever the interface can do. And so the issue then for us is, in the future, when we want to enable these experiences, we need to be crystal clear what we are trying to move forward. Which coupling of the assets and technologies we want and need together in order to reproduce this experience. So the basic terminology that we were trying to think about, how we could explain how ephemeral the digital is basically to introduce kind of a terminology that, yes, file is what we often talk about as a digital object. But then you have the software is almost decoder of it. And then you got digital artifact. But that digital artifact is, we call it artifact because it has its shape, it has its form. But it is ephemeral. And it's experienced at the very moment. And the only reason why we feel that there is consistency in our experiences. So when you open that Word document or open the PDF document, you want it to be the same every time. But if you look at the system, it's never the same. It's just that the applications are created so that we have some consistency. Otherwise, we call it a bug. If it is not consistent, something went wrong. If something changes, oh, something changed. So it must be there's a bug in the system. So software developers work very hard to create consistency. But in fact, the whole system is very dependent on the environment. And every time you run it is different. Okay. So the issue is the technology does change very rapidly. And then the question only is, and that is the one that the PERSIST is trying to address as part of the UNESCO initiative, is really, what is it, how are we going to do, how are we going to create the access, this experience of digital in the future? So it's not just putting files and metadata about them, and it's not always just migrating to the next thing, because the migration may not preserve your experience. So the one aspect that's also very important is the fact that the digitalized content is of main concern for many, many countries. Often when we in UNESCO discuss the problem of obsolescence, people always talk about digitalization. So they would very proudly say, okay, the government gave us money, we have now managed to put this archive in digital, and I would just go, okay, and what did you do with the original? And just hoping that you didn't do anything to it, it's still there. Because very little thought is given to how ephemeral this even digitalized copy is, and how dependent it is on the software. So here is just showing a digitized document. Another one is a born digital document. And they're both in the same format. So that means they're both subject to the same issues, subject to the same issues of obsolescence. So even if you have digitalized content, you still need a reader. And that reader at the moment is PDF reader, because most of the standards at the moment are related to PDF. And it is important to understand that we are making a big bet that the PDF reader will be around forever. So that, well, one can argue, well, this is okay, because maintaining one application forever perhaps is not such a big deal. The issue is going to be that in 10 years from now, 20 years from now, you know, my kids never look at the PDFs now. They're all on text messages and, you know, short messages. But in 10 years from now, maybe holographic images, maybe something completely different. And then we'll be thinking, how are we going to move our PDFs into new formats so that it's accessible and experienced? Okay. So the point is that all our digital assets are impossible to access unless there is some software. So we always depend on the software. And I just want to say this is an issue because our preservation efforts are done through digital tools. And I'm sure you're aware of this. I just want to bring this up in one particular context. This is a company called Tamal Vista. This is a colleague of mine who is in South Korea working with a number of preservation initiatives when the Fremery. So he and his team created the software because they realized there was a real pain in Korea and in China because the OCR software doesn't work. And I'm sure that's with all scripts that are really difficult to handle when they're digitized. So this is one example where they have a software that you can import your digitalized copies. And if you have a problem because the copy is not very well scanned, and you will need to search, so they can do the segmentation of characters and they can index. So essentially, this is a software, this is one of the features. It's a small team of people who have done something really good. And working with monasteries in Taiwan, in particular with the Fo Guan Shan, it's a Buddhist movement, in fact. We have a number of operations that they want to bring the Buddhist scripts to the public. They have a museum, and they are thinking about their projects are really on the scale of decades and impact in the scale of decades. So before, as Raio mentioned, the systems become old. But in this particular case, what will happen is that the company like Tamal Vista may be around for 10 years, 20 years, and the project needs to last for 40 years. So it's not just the system is gone, but the expertise is gone. Yeah. So the only question then is there anything that this company can do, except for putting in open source and hoping that the community is going to take it up? Is there anything that this company can do to make sure that what the project has done will last? And the answer in this case is yes. They're actually thinking actively how to manage the life cycle of their software. And this is exactly what Ravi said. What is the standard? In this case, I would call it, what is the best practice? What is the best practice for a vendor before the vendor that releases the software? And should they think about how to age the software? So it's not a surprise it stopped working. No, we know it's going to stop working. That's inevitable. It's going to stop working because the demand is going to go down. And the second thing, it's not going to be enough, or somebody else is going to come in and make this software a feature of a bigger product, but not compatible. And it's impossible to force the ICT industry to be uniformly compatible because they're everywhere in the world. So we can artificially try to force it, but it's not going to work because the nature of innovation is such that we all continue innovating, and the standards are extremely important once innovation is in place to spread. So we almost move in layers. Every time innovation takes off, like in this case now, say mobile phones, in order to get the full scale, internationalize it, then we establish a standard. So United States has the same as Europe, same as China. Why is it? Because then the market is unified and the companies can come in and serve everybody. Then somebody makes a step change, disrupts everything. And then comes chaos for a while, and then another standard. And again, so we're always going to steps like that. Standards are good, they're absolutely necessary to create value, but they also don't last, and we need to be ready for the next. So the point here is, in these companies that are serving us our preservation effort, they will be gone, the software will be gone. Can we do something? And so there are a number of different techniques that could be applied, and I'll comment on them because they are being looked at by Persist in particular. But just from the ecosystem point of view, the main issue is the control and empowerment. At the moment, there is an imbalance because the ICT industry can bring to the market at any point in time any software, and they can take it away at any time. The only reason why they're not taking it away is because they need you. They want customers. But once they are done, once there are no customers, if they go bankrupt, then we are completely disempowered. So at the moment, the issue is that ICT community, I call them, they are not committed to the long-term vision and mission that we often have in our minds when we create something, whether we create our own book or we are preserving somebody else's book. Yeah. So the community, ICT community, is not just commercial organizations. It is open source community, is me as a professor at University of Nottingham, because I create software, my students create software. We are all in it. And among ourselves, probably there are many of us, because we all start tinkering with things, creating little apps, creating websites, and so on. Yeah, so in a way, ICT community is anybody who creates any technology that other people are using. And so we are disconnecting that from those who have content, technology users. And that needs to come together. Without that, we are not going to make any progress because of the dependency, the very nature of dependency that exists. The file needs the application to create the experience. And so based on my experience with work on planets, this was a 4-year project, European project that was supported in order to create tools. And we were so proud to say these are practical tools, things that can be used by the community. Then we moved to SCAPE. SCAPE was about creating services. We wanted to create at scale preservation services. So from my experience then, there was always this dilemma about migration of files and how that's done optimally, and what are the technologies and scale, how would we handle the economic aspects of it. But one thing has to be absolutely clear. When one decides to migrate, that means that they're completely giving up on the original file and giving up on the original application. That's what it is. Because if I had the WordPerfect document, it was done with WordPerfect, say, 5.0, and I decided to move it to PDF. What I have done now, I said, goodbye my WordPerfect file, and I'm unable to run the WordPerfect application. Therefore, I'm now committing to another software, PDF Reader and PDF format. From now on, I'm going to move forward with the capabilities of the PDF Reader software. And so in this particular case, this example, when we go from very rich representation of text in WordPerfect to impoverished PDF, we have actually agreed that you're going to give up on some interaction with a digital artifact that's being created. Yeah? So migration should be looked at as one of the ways of handling this obsolescence of application. I'm just showing here, this is in fact a virtualized Microsoft Word 2.0 from 1992. So you can actually have the original application if you want to. It's not a problem. And this was virtualized on a contemporary cloud with VirtualBox, for example. And so we have also converted it. This is Word 2.0 showing the same file as Office 2007, I believe. This is the first one that had XML format. Okay? So you can have both. And when I was still working for Microsoft, then I basically said to my colleagues, so why don't we just virtualize this and show people can have things continuously? And they said, okay, well, Natasha, go and find out whether there is demand for it. And then I decided to start my own company. But then the point here is that nobody asked them. So basically they said, well, nobody asked. So there's disconnect. We can go and ask. Microsoft has all the software ever released. They're sitting on one server. I can show you because I know it is there. It's just not available. So this is the question only. If you decide on a strategy, a migration strategy for files, you can think that there is another one that you can approach. Most of the time with the open source community, we count on keeping the files and then having a source code to adjust the application. So that's another option, and that's a very good option if you have open source software, but the economic factor then needs to be taken into account. Because any development costs. It costs lots of money, in fact. The very moment when you decide that you are going to take care of the software, it's you now responsible for it until you can continue doing it while there's demand and while you can pay your people. You need to feed them. So it's always, value has to be created, but then it's normally created through user effort. So this is the second part, second strategy of dealing. And the third strategy is the one that I just mentioned, when you decide not to give up on your files, and you decide not to give up on your application, and you encapsulate. So encapsulation meaning put it in a virtual machine, protect it from the rest of the environment, so there are no interactions with it, but you can run sort of original. I'm saying sort of because once things are encapsulated, it all depends on the design of the application. If the design of the application is such that they can be neatly put in a container and then used, then it's fine. And the first thing, again, what Ivo mentioned about standardization, I will again talk about best practices for the software engineers to think about a life cycle of the software and say, I'm going to design it so that at some point can be nicely contained and the people can continue to have interaction and maximize the utility of that application even though it's not connected with the contemporary ecosystem. So virtualization of software and putting next to it the content, that basically is the way that you might be able to manage the digital continuity, I would call, of the pairing of the two, of the digital artifacts, or the experiences. So here I'm just showing that virtualization is something that is doable, and based on work that we have done as researcher and also what I'm doing as Intact Digital, my company, you can go back 30 years, you can go back to 1980 very easily. So on the left side is, I think this was XP, and this is 2000. So this is 2003, in 2000, operating systems, you can have them virtualized. And then you can run applications that we all used to run. On the left side is the map point. I'm not sure if anybody remembers this. I was very pleased to show this to my kids because they think that I was kind of living in Stone Ages, so that we didn't have maps at the time. Now I have Google Maps and Bing Maps and so on. It's like this. I claim actually, look, we had maps too. So this was an application map point, and the other one was a Money 2003. So those things are now obsolete. You can't, in a sense, you can't run them necessarily on the operating system. Maybe you can, because Microsoft is trying to maintain some consistency. But you can go all the way back to 98 or even earlier, 95. So it's possible. There's absolutely no reason why you would not have this. And so continuity could be thought through as part of digital continuity could be thought through as a combination of methods. And so it's a kind of a continuum from virtualization that is really encapsulating and recreating the experiences with the artifacts, all the way to going to transformation in order to be used within the contemporary ecosystem. But then the transformation of files is not articulated as a preservation strategy. It is an access strategy and a strategy for creating more value. Even when I'm writing my paper, academic paper, what I do is I may use TeX or I may use a Word, then I turn it into PDF and I turn it into HTML. So even now in the contemporary system, I have 3 versions. Why? Because each version creates more value for me. PDF is going to go to a conference, HTML is going to go on the web. So it's providing me with the opportunity to reach more audiences. So my strategy in having multiple file systems is to spread and provide people with a capability of reusing my content, reusing literally if they want to, but also experiencing it differently. Yeah. So to put this now in the context of UNESCO, Memory of the World program has been concerned with the digital heritage, pardon me, with the national heritage generally. So it's a world's heritage that's of concern. So in many instances, they would have in their register, they would have designated artifacts that would be labeled as UNESCO protected. So that's how they started originally. But then guess what happened to them, just as it happened to everybody? Digital came around. And so suddenly everybody's stunned, what do we do now with this thing? It is really hard to say, oh, hey, this is the physical artifact, it's sitting right there, and this is UNESCO as sort of protected. So digital has surprised everybody. Memory of the World program equally felt that it's very important now to look at what the digital aspects need to be taken into consideration. So we started PERSIST in 2013 in The Hague with a discussion about how are we going to enhance the effort so that we can guarantee that digital heritage stays available forever. And that's how PERSIST was born. So PERSIST was an attempt to start reasoning about it. And the mission of it is a very bold mission. It's basically saying that we want to keep digital heritage safe and accessible forever. And there are other things you see that UNESCO is concerned. It has to be equal access. So it has to be should be no barriers for people to access. So it's universal access to digital, which brings the other dimensions of the rights, also of the capabilities, infrastructure, and so on. But more of interest to this community would be the structure of it. So UNESCO PERSIST is trying to cover 3 main areas, because whenever we looked at the problem, we realized it's not just technology, it's not just policy, it's not just about content, it's all 3 together. So we're trying to, I would think of these as different types of competencies that we need to pull together in order to have best practices, technologies, and policies to work. And how does it work then within UNESCO? Say we may have a working group, it says, okay, we want to have a dialogue with industry, commercial organizations about licenses. Okay, so we can have a work group, we get experts who want to outline the issues with licenses, and then the dialogue starts among all the stakeholders. So that's the mechanism by which UNESCO would like to move forward. At the moment, with respect to PERSIST, we are just repositioning within UNESCO to become a subcommittee of a Memory of the World program. Because then that gives us exposure to 200 member states. There's a clear path. If you have a working group, and working group decides that these are the recommendations, then we can surface them to the top, to the secretariat, goes all the way to the UNESCO advisory board, and then they vote. So if you want something internationally done, UNESCO is a very good vehicle. So the reason for PERSIST was exactly the same story I said before about the imbalance. We have providers and enablers. These are ICT industry offering tools to libraries, archives, cultural institutions. So these are the IBMs and Microsofts and open source community, whoever. They are offering solutions. But it goes one way. As I said, that there is imbalance at the moment in the control. So the idea was that PERSIST is in between and creates a dialogue. So it's a bridge. Let's talk together about these issues. So the idea first is to, this is what we have already. So we have PERSIST program already working, and now repositioning within UNESCO. And the next thing, we will put online the guidelines how we are going to engage with the community. And it's going to be through expert groups and work groups. And then different committees to move particular agenda forward. We already have a selection guidelines that are done by the content group. So the selection guidelines by UNESCO PERSIST are available. One can find them on the site. But another aspect that we want to do in order to become more efficient in working with the industry is to establish a foundation. So Persist Foundation would host the software that is, host the virtualized software, legacy software that is required, needed by the preservation communities or needed by anybody who needs to preserve the digital heritage. And it's not that UNESCO Foundation, Persist Foundation would be a centralized place to solve all the problems. It's not. It's the organization to negotiate licenses with industry. And once, the ideal situation, for example, would be that instead of each library archive going to Microsoft, IBM, Apple and others, Adobe, for example, and say, okay, can we have a license for software, 5 versions back? We basically have some sort of policy statement saying, anybody who is in preservation can use freely software that is not being sold anymore and is not maintained anymore. So if you're not earning any money, if you're not maintaining, why don't you let people install it? They'll do it the way they know how to do it. You just don't prevent from that being done. Yeah. So in a way, the foundation, the reason why we would need to put this in place is because all the conversation we had so far as part of Persist with industry were extremely encouraging and positive. The companies came back to us and said, so tell us what the next step is. And we started scratching our heads. Well, we don't have a legal entity to even hold these licenses. Even if somebody gives a license to UNESCO, cannot hold it, because UNESCO is not an organization, technical organization that, or legal organization that would hold the licenses of software. So you need another entity that would basically have a contractual agreement and be able to then distribute to the community. And so also, the foundation is also probably being modeled as a franchise. So every nation or wherever people feel that they need to have an outpost should have the similar outlet. So that's basically the objective of the Persist. We are sort of, at the moment, putting foundation, waiting for first to finish the repositioning within UNESCO, because we would like foundation to be associated with UNESCO. Otherwise, any of you can start a foundation. You can go and negotiate with Microsoft and others, no problem. Anybody can do it. The problem is that without UNESCO endorsement, it's really hard to go and negotiate. And to get endorsement, you have to sort of align with the procedures within UNESCO to get a rubber stamp. So that's where it's taking time, because we need to follow their procedures. Yeah. So I would just like to kind of conclude. Without working with the ICT community, we won't get very far. But there is another very important element, and basically, as I've already pointed, we need also mechanisms in place to start economy around the legacy, call it legacy software, legacy content. We need economy around it, because that's the only way we can make the preservation or long-term access as part of normal practice. Yeah, that's the only way. And so here we really need ingredients, and UNESCO Persist is trying to create some of these ingredients, like try to handle licenses. I'm very sure you had lots of issues with copyright, with publishers. Now imagine that has to be handled also with software. Then there's the issue of orphan. The colleagues at Stanford, for example, last time we spoke about games, they had fantastic archive of games, and they said, it's not a problem. If you can identify who produced it, it's not a problem. You just knock on the door, talk to the people. But the problem is when you don't have anybody to talk to, and then you're in dilemma, what do you do? So they would be also very pleased to have a working group on that, just to understand, let's understand what are the best practices we can put in place. But generally, without a sustainable economic system, it's really, really hard to move anything forward. So first it's about economy around retired software. Then we need this legal framework, licensing whatever is required. And then, of course, we need practices. And now, of course, if we have practices, then we can go from cooking to restaurants, what the arrival said. Then you can, once you know what you want, then you can tell people to create services, and they will do most of the things, especially chores, for you. So the only way we can achieve this is by covering all these aspects. And UNESCO persists is trying to put the foundations, at least for the legal framework, and for these licenses that would allow us to start that process. Yeah, thank you very much.